So for today's video, I wanted to be really intentional and mindful on how I share it and how I cultivate the conversation around it, because it's something that is kind of coming into the spotlight again, and something that I think needs to be handled with care, but also needs to be addressed, because this is something that I think for so long, again, we have completely misunderstood and maybe not been as kind and as compassionate as we could have been. And I think it's time that we, number one, give this person her flowers, but then number two, continue just to love and support, obviously, even from a distance, but change the narrative or change the dialogue when it comes to talking about this person, especially because I think there are just more things coming to light about her. Today we're talking all things Amanda Bynes. Let's dive on in. Amanda Bynes was born April 3rd, 1986. She is 37, almost 34 years old. She was born to Rick Bynes in Lynn, Oregon. Now, I want to focus today on her achievements, and then I also want to talk, maybe more importantly, about the dialogue that's been happening around her mental health and mental illness, because I think for so long there has just been such negative and hateful and disrespectful comments made about something that deserves compassion and our empathy and kindness. So let's talk about how Amanda Bynes became who Amanda Bynes is. Now, based on the reading and research that I was able to do, Amanda Bynes really rose to fame due to Nickelodeon. Between the years of 1996 and 2002, Amanda Bynes starred on shows like All That, and she even got her own spin-off show called The Amanda Show. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, All That was kind of like a sketch comedy show, kind of like SNL, but made for kids. And so she was on that, and then she kind of got her own sketch comedy show, kind of like Carol Burnett, but again for kids. And Amanda Bynes really just skyrocketed to fame. Now, after 2003, she was growing up and realized, okay, I want to do something different. And so between 2003 and 2006, she had a show that I don't feel like is talked about enough, which I genuinely loved, which was a show with Jenny Garth, and it was What I Like About You. And her and Jenny Garth play sisters, and it's just a fun, silly, simple, comedic show. And so she was on that show for quite a few years, but even during that show, she made some of my favorite teen rom-com movies that I still watch to this day. The first movie being What a Girl Wants. She made that in 2003. And then in 2006, she made probably one of her most infamous movies, I feel like. But it's also the movie that caused a lot of depression and anxiety and unhealthiness, which we'll get to in a minute. But that's She's the Man. In 2007, she made movies like Sydney White and Hairspray. And then in 2010, I think that was kind of her last movie, which was Easy A. So that's a little brief history. In 2010, she had mentioned that she is quitting acting. Now, back then, we were all like, wait, what? You're so young. Why would you want to quit acting? That doesn't make any sense. But a few years later, it would be very clear that mentally and emotionally, she was just not in a healthy place. Now, although that was seen publicly a few years later, I would venture to say that privately it had been happening for quite a long time. So one of the things that she had mentioned was during She's the Man and watching She's the Man, that actually messed with her mental and emotional space so much so that it created symptoms of body dysmorphia. Now, I have not seen an official diagnosis or anything like that, but reading interviews from, I believe, 2018, she talked about how when she would watch She's the Man, it created such a confusion and frustration and a disgust of her own physical body. Body dysmorphia is very much like that, where it's obviously, as females, we all have like things about our bodies that we don't necessarily love, or we're like, we could do without this, or we could work on this. But with body dysmorphia, it's such an obsessive thought, and it's such a hateful and such a cruel thought and feeling that we have about our body, and it becomes physically uncomfortable to be in our physical body. And so it seemed more on that extreme when it came to Amanda Bynes and rewatching things like She's the Man. Again, these are movies that brought so much joy and excitement to us, especially for millennials. But for her, it's one of those things that really created a deep internal struggle. Along with the struggles of her body and being confident, she had mentioned that she actually became addicted to Adderall, which growing up as a millennial, early 2000s, I remember the craze of Adderall. Now, for those of you who don't know, Adderall is actually an amphetamine that's meant to help people with ADHD. It helps the part of the brain to focus and calm and kind of hone in on what you need to do. But back in the early 2000s, especially models and certain actresses and even actors, they would use Adderall to actually lose weight. And so for Amanda Bynes, she had mentioned she would lie to doctors, get the prescription, and she would use it as the skinny pill that it was in the early 2000s. For her internally, she felt so disgusted with her own body that she became addicted to things to change her body. But not only that, she talked about how she started smoking weed around 16 years old, but then she even talked about how she got into the world of ecstasy and Molly. And those are such extreme drugs where people can literally die from experimenting with them. Molly and ecstasy are both extreme drugs that will alter your state of mind, your functioning, your ability, all the above. And I think when I read that, I realized, I think she was trying to disconnect so much from her physical body that she was willing to risk anything and do anything. And for somebody to be in that kind of state of mind where they don't even want to physically be in their body when, outside looking in, things look great. She is on top of the world. She is killing it in the box office. But when she comes home and when she's by herself, she is so disgusted and disconnected with herself. It makes me really sad. Something that I've noticed with comedians, and I'm not saying all comedians, but something that I've noticed with comedians are those who are often giving people the ability and freedom to laugh are typically struggling internally the most. I think a part of them doesn't want anybody to ever feel what they feel, and so they're going to make sure that they give the gift of laughter. I also think, though, too, they're projecting what they wish they maybe would have felt on the inside. Oftentimes, I think of Robin Williams, who was wonderful actor, obviously a great comedian, but he was just a great actor. But unfortunately, he took his own life. And when I see people like that, when I hear about people like that, I think of Amanda Bynes, where she gave us the gift of laughter, even at such a young age. And I think she really struggled with things like anxiety, symptoms of body dysmorphia, but definitely depression. And this is something that she's even come out recently with. A few days ago, she talked about how her fight with depression has led to a weight gain. And so she's mentioned depression being something that she struggles with. So as I mentioned before, 2010 is when she kind of said, hey, I'm done acting. And outside looking in, you're like, wait, what? How are you done acting? Like, you're on top of the world. But in 2012, I think it started to become publicly evident of, there's been an internal struggle happening for a long time. The first thing happening with a DUI in 2012. But then in 2013, that's when I think, again, publicly, we're like, there's more going on. And I remember when pictures were coming out with her in her wig and just her looking like mentally and emotionally, there's stuff happening. The conversation in the comments were so harsh and so mean of like, what happened to her? Why is she so crazy? Why is she acting out? Blah, blah, blah. And I remember looking at those pictures and thinking, man, something's happening privately that we're now seeing manifest publicly. And my heart just broke for her because, again, like Britney Spears, when that whole thing happened in 2007, my heart initially broke because I'm like, man, what she's doing publicly is an internal sign of what's happening. And one of the things that happened in 2013 is Amanda Bynes was actually forced into a 5150. And for those of you who don't know, a 5150 is when an adult is placed in an involuntary, so they're not going willingly, they're forced into a 72-hour psychiatric hold. And this is something that happened in 2013. With that, in 2013, a conservatorship happened for Amanda Bynes. Now, for anybody who watched my Britney Spears video, if you have not, you can watch it. The link is in the description. But we talked about Britney Spears' conservatorship. And so Amanda Bynes was placed in a very similar conservatorship. And again, just briefly going over that, conservatorship is basically the concept of the person no longer has a right, no longer has access, no longer has a say in their own being. That means their physical being, their financial being, their well-being, none of it. Her parents could say basically what she spent money on, how she spent money, if she spent money. They could also talk They could also say, you go here, you do this, you see this doctor, you don't see this doctor, whatever they wanted. That's kind of what the conservatorship is. I personally feel like for somebody to lose all autonomy and lose all power and sense of control in their darkest moment doesn't necessarily help all the time. And so those are just my 2 cents on conservatorship. Now, again, she was under conservatorship. Something interesting that I found when doing my reading and research on Amanda Bynes, and kind of goes to her parents, is for the longest time, I didn't know much about her parents. I still don't know much about her parents. But from what I read and researched and, listened to in interviews, she wasn't necessarily close to her parents. And so when I read that kind of stuff, it makes me weary of them being over her everything. And not close in the sense of they just didn't get along, like, mom and daughter just not getting along. But they were not close in the sense of she actually wanted to emancipate herself when she was like 14 or 15 or 16, around that time. And now part of that was due to Dan Schneider, which we'll get to in a minute. But just to even be that distance from your parents, I don't know if it was a forced distance or if there was just an unhealthy dynamic because she was now bringing all this money in, and parents of child stars typically, unfortunately, will abuse and use that. So I don't know if they were those parents, but it was just interesting that I thought I would point out, because I do think relationship with parents also does play a part in our mental and emotional health. So this brings me all to what has been recently happening and what recently came out. And this is, again, a conversation that I want to be so careful in, because it's, again, just coming out and it's just recent. And they're in their sensitive topics of just sexual, emotional, mental abuse and minors. So I want to be very careful in how I do it, but I think it's such a big part of her story, because what she seemingly went through plays a big part into who she became. We'll just start with the documentary. So this past month in March, a documentary came out. I watched it on HBO Max, but I think it was a Discovery documentary, but it was called Quiet on the Set. And it was a documentary that was basically talking about the children and child actors who started off on Nickelodeon and were part of ensemble casts like Zoe 101, all that, The Amanda Bynes Show, Drake and Josh, iCarly, all that stuff. To be honest, I was not a big Nickelodeon person when I was young. And it's interesting because I remember my parents being like, I don't like how they portray themselves, and there's just something odd about Nickelodeon. And I remember thinking, that's so rude. Like, all my friends watch it and I can't watch it. But now I'm so thankful for their discernment, because the things that are coming out now about what happened behind closed doors is just really scary and upsetting and just so sad. I did sneak in episodes of all that and The Amanda Bynes Show. This documentary comes out and it talks primarily about 2 of the head honchos, one of them being Brian Peck, who I believe was brought on to Nickelodeon to help with dialogue and speech, and really became I don't even want to use the word mentor, but really kind of partnered with, he was discussing monster. We'll just put that out there, but he was hired on to help people, I think, with their lines and things like that. But then the other big one was Dan Schneider. Now, Dan Schneider, from what I know, from the little that I know, was basically I don't know if the creative Nickelodeon is the right word, but he really created the meat of Nickelodeon and the nostalgia of Nickelodeon. And he was the producer and creator of a lot of honestly iconic shows from late 90s to, I think, honestly, until mid 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. When it comes to Amanda Bynes, like I said, rose to fame on Nickelodeon. Dan Schneider is the one that brought her onto Nickelodeon. She became part of the cast of all that. And this documentary talked a lot about Amanda Bynes. Now, I do want to clarify, Amanda Bynes was not part of this documentary. She did not do an interview. She did not talk in the documentary, but they talked a lot about her story on the documentary. And so anyway, she did all that, and then she did the Amanda Bynes Show. And as I mentioned, her and her parents were seemingly not close. And I do want to clarify, I don't know if it's because they weren't great parents or if Dan created a wedge in between her and her parents, because that was something that he seemingly did when it came to the people that he worked with, which, just an FYI, oftentimes when you're in an abusive relationship, the abuser will isolate you from any kind of friends and community that you are a part of. They want you one-on-one, and they will then, and in that process, they will literally manipulate and twist your thoughts to think everybody is against you except them. So then you become dependent, and you need them, and that's the goal. So with that being said, unfortunately, I think Dan Schneider did that with a lot of the kids. And honestly, with Amanda Bynes, it could be a mixture of both, right? Where Dan created the wedge because he saw the unhealthy dynamic with her parents. So all that to say, Dan Schneider was the one that had kind of said, hey, if you get emancipated, then you're over yourself and you can do all this. But I think he wanted to kind of take her under his wing, whatever that means. So anyway, she's on the show. She's with Dan Schneider. And I think he even went to What I Like About You with Amanda Bynes, which again, that's the sitcom that she did after the Amanda Bynes show. So like between the years of 2003 to 2006, which again, she's a teenager or a young adult she's a young adult, I believe, in those years. And so it's just weird that he's literally with her since childhood to young adult years. And again, because she wasn't part of the documentary, I don't want to speculate on her story, and I want to be very mindful of that. Based on the testimonials of other people, though, it was a horrible, unhealthy, abusive, manipulative environment to work in. When you're a kid who grows up in an environment like that, number one, when you're a kid and you're a child star, you're already missing developmental milestones that will almost guarantee you struggling when you're an adult, because there are certain milestones developmentally that typically need to be reached for us to have a healthy adulthood. Child stars do not reach those milestones. A lot of times we see childhood stars almost act immature or crazy when they're older, but that's because there's such a high expectation on them when they were younger to be adults and perfect and make the money and bring in the cash and literally provide for their family, which is crazy if you think about it, right? You're literally expecting a child to provide for your whole family. And so just to give a little perspective, I think that's part of the struggle with Amanda Bynes growing up in that environment. But the other big struggle that I think is important to note, when growing up in that kind of environment, mentally and emotionally, possibly physically, being abused, misused, that also plays a part in your mental health when you grow up. Because what trauma can do is, when trauma happens, it stays with us, like in each and every season of our life. And if there haven't been people in Amanda Bynes' corner and in her life that have truly walked with her through healing, that trauma is going to be relived and manifested throughout the rest of her life. And it's going to, again, for us, it's going to look crazy, but for her, it's an expression. It's a way to release and to work through it, maybe not in a healthy way, but that's how she's doing it. So going back to the idea of her doing things like Molly and ecstasy, that sounds crazy to us. That sounds like, why would you ever do that? Well, if she went through trauma, which I'm sure she did as a child, you're going to want to forget that. You're going to want to not feel that. You're not going to want to be part of your body. And so that to me is, I think, such a big part of Amanda Bynes' journey, is like how she grew up is not how kids are meant to grow up. Before I move on to the last part of this video, I do just want to make a note that I think is interesting. And I don't think there's any hard evidence of this. So I also do want to clarify that, but I don't want to ignore it. There has been rumors, or there have been people who have done some investigating on TikTok, which TikTok people need to all just become like CIA agents. Like, the way you guys decipher things and break down things blows my mind. And typically there's truth to what people say. But with that being said, one of the things that I saw that I thought was really interesting is when Amanda Bynes was under conservatorship, one of the things that, we all take for granted and we all get to use that she didn't get to use freely were things like social media, and one of them being Twitter. And there's a thought that's been going around, and that's kind of been, almost like, I wouldn't say proven, but there's just been a lot of evidence about it or around it. And that's the idea that Amanda Bynes was under a surname for Twitter, Ashley Banks. Now, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because I think it's important to talk about some of the things that this surname, Ashley Banks, had mentioned. One of them being that imagine getting pregnant by your boss and you had to get rid of the baby at the age of 13. Now, if this is Amanda Bynes and her story, man, the ultimate abuse of a child and the mistrust and the hurt and the trauma that she faced, there are no words. There are no words. And I get really sad when I think about things like that, because I know that stuff happens, and I don't think we recognize it. We just see these childhood stars growing up as being crazy, when it's really these childhood stars growing up with undealt with trauma, and they missed people in their life who were going to cherish them and love them and know how to steward their hearts and their minds. Instead, they grow up with people who abuse and misuse their hearts and their minds. If the whole Ashley Banks things is real, there were a lot of things exposed on Twitter that Amanda Bynes could have possibly gone through that would explain a lot of the behaviors that we are now seeing, or that we have seen in the past few years. So this brings me to the last part of the video that I want to talk about, and that is the mental illness of it all. Mental illness is something that a lot of Americans struggle with. When it comes to childhood stars, there's more of a likeliness that they're going to struggle with some sort of mental and emotional illness the older that they get, because again, when they grow up in certain environments and they miss certain developmental points in their life, mentally they're going to be struggling down the road. And when it comes to Amanda Bynes, again, I think the only thing that has been confirmed by her is she does struggle with depression. My hope and my prayer, genuine hope and prayer, is that there are people in her life, there are therapists, there are psychiatrists and psychologists, mentors, whoever, that are in her life, not because of her being Amanda Bynes, but because of her being a human with a human heart, with a human mind, that just needs time and ways to heal, and tangible coping skills and ways to work through the uncomfortable feelings. Because if I were a betting woman, I would also bet that Amanda Bynes is a deep feeler. Meaning, if people are sad, she gets depressed. If people are upset, she goes into maybe a rage. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I have a lot of people that I meet with that are deep feelers. I'm a deep feeler. In the entertainment industry, a majority of people are deep feelers. That's what makes them good at what they do, whether it's a singer, whether it's an actor, an actress, an artist, a songwriter, whatever the case may be. But I would bet Amanda Bynes is a deep feeler. And I say that to say something that I'm hoping and praying is that she has people in her life that are going to teach her how to figure out those feelings and figure out how to understand, but also how to regulate those emotions, not how to get rid of them. And I think that's why sometimes people do drugs, is because they want to forget their feelings. They want to numb their feelings. They want to ignore their feelings. But I think in reality, if we learn how to steward them, if we learn how to regulate them, if we learn how to acknowledge them and use them for our benefit, feelings are beautiful. They're wonderful, complicated, but they're wonderful. And so all that to say, I'm hoping that Amanda Bynes has people in her life that are there for her heart and her head, not for her title. Again, along with depression, she has talked about how she has really struggled with the relationship with her body, especially after She's the Man came out. And the other big piece is that I am almost 100% positive that she has experienced trauma on different levels and in different ways, and in ways that no one is ever meant to experience. And if that's not walked through, and if that's not healed, and if that's not acknowledged and, it's taken into consideration, that will definitely again manifest itself down the road. And for the outside, the public, it will look crazy, but internally it will feel hard and heavy and just uncomfortable. Last that I've seen and heard, I think Amanda Bynes is going for her cosmetology license, or if she's not already licensed, and she just wants to do like hair and makeup and nails, which I think is amazing. The other thing before I close, because I think this is important too, the other thing that I think is important as these documentaries will keep coming out, because unfortunately, I don't think this is the last one. I know that they're talking about another episode coming out, but I'm talking about in general. I don't think that this is the last that we'll hear of childhood stars coming out and revealing things in the light that were hidden in the dark for years. Although we grew up with these people on our TV screens, although we feel a parasocial relationship with them, they don't owe us anything. Now, does sharing your story bring a sense of freedom? Yes. But do they owe us their story? No. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because some of us are like, well, when's this person going to share? Why didn't this person share? Why didn't this person share? Where's this person? Where's their... And each person is on their own journey, and I'm hoping all of them on the journey of healing and wholeness and recovering from the horrible situations and things that they were put in by their parents or other people. And so I just think as stories keep coming out, as Amanda Bynes' story probably keeps unfolding, it's going to be important for us again to show compassion and grace and empathy, but also know that her story is her story. She doesn't owe us anything. She has given more than we deserve. She has given movies in her heart and, you know, things that made us feel joy and happiness. And so if she shares her story in private, that's totally her right to do so. If she shares her story in public one day, then it's going to be an honor to hear it. But she doesn't owe us anything. They don't owe us anything. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I know it's a little bit heavy and maybe hard to listen to. But again, it was something that I've been feeling that, especially after watching the documentary, it kind of confirmed this was the next video that I wanted to do. And I just wanted to be intentional and kind and mindful of how I did it. So that's why it didn't come out last week, but it just came out today. Again, if you guys like all things mental health, therapy, pop culture, reality TV, then this might be the channel for you. I would love for you to take some time, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and turn on your notifications. That way you guys are notified when brand new videos are out and ready for you to check out. Be sure to tune in next week for a brand new video. Until next time, guys.